Have you ever been judged before you even opened your mouth? Imagine walking into first class, ticket in hand, your success earned through sleepless nights and brutal negotiations, only to be told you don't belong because of the color of your skin. What do you do when the very system you've mastered turns on you in front of a watching world, not for something you've done, but for who you are? Jamal Richardson felt the familiar calm of Seat 2A, the plush leather a quiet reward for a week of war in Atlanta. He was on his way to San Francisco. The deal finally closed, the victory a quiet hum beneath his skin. The low drone of the Boeing 777 was a soothing soundtrack to his thoughts, a promise of home. He loosened his tie, the fabric a small concession to comfort after days spent in the armor of a tailored black suit. He belonged here. He had earned this. But as he settled in, a shadow fell over him, sharp and unwelcome. A flight attendant, her name tag reading Brenda, offered a smile that was all mechanics and no warmth. It was a corporate smile, a weapon disguised as welcome. "Sir," she began, her voice pitched just loud enough for the neighboring seats to hear. "I'm sorry, but there appears to be a mistake. This seat is taken." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. A mistake. Jamal held her gaze, his own calm a stark contrast to the performative concern on her face. The low hum of the engines seemed to fade, replaced by a sudden, ringing silence. He felt the shift in the cabin's atmosphere, the subtle turning of heads, the quick, curious glances. He was no longer a passenger. He was a problem. He calmly reached into his breast pocket and presented his first-class ticket, the crisp paper a testament to his right to be there. "Seat 2A, he said, his voice even, steady. "Jamal Richardson." She barely glanced at it. Her eyes flicked from the ticket to his face and back again, a silent, insulting dismissal. "I understand, sir," she said, her voice louder now, a performance for the gallery of suited white men around them. "But we have a priority passenger. There's been a system error. We can find you another seat in the main cabin." The main cabin. The words were a casual demotion, a public stripping of status. The other passengers weren't pretending anymore. They were staring openly, their faces a mixture of mild irritation and smug curiosity. He could feel their judgment, their silent, racist assumptions clicking into place. He must have used points. He must have gotten a lucky upgrade. He doesn't really belong here. The humiliation was a hot, metallic taste in his mouth. He was a man who commanded boardrooms, a man whose decisions moved markets. Yet here, in this pressurized tube of judgment at 30,000 feet, he was being treated like a trespasser. He politely refused to move. He would not participate in his own degradation. "I believe I'm in the correct seat," he stated, his voice a low counterpoint to her rising pitch. "But if there's a problem with your system, perhaps you could call a supervisor." This was not the response she wanted. Her smile vanished, replaced by a tight, brittle line. She saw his quiet refusal not as a defense of his dignity, but as a challenge to her authority. With a dramatic sigh, she pressed the call button above his head. The small light felt like an alarm, signaling his otherness to the entire cabin. Before we continue, tell us where you are watching from, and if this story touches you, make sure you subscribe because tomorrow, I have saved something extra special for you. Moments later, a man with a crisp uniform and an even crisper demeanor arrived. Mr. Delaney, the cabin manager. He exuded an air of bored, procedural power. "Problem here?" he asked, his eyes sweeping over Jamal, taking in the suit, the dark skin, the unapologetic presence in a first-class seat. Brenda spoke first, her voice laced with manufactured distress. "This passenger is in the wrong seat and is refusing to cooperate. He's disrupting pre-flight procedures." The accusation was a lie, a neat piece of corporate fiction designed to frame him as the aggressor. Jamal held out his ticket for the second time. "My boarding pass says 2A, he said, his patience wearing thin. "I'd just like to understand what the issue is." Delaney took the ticket, his glance as brief and dismissive as Brenda's. He handed it back with a small, condescending shrug. "System glitches happen, sir. It's an unfortunate but common issue with oversold flights. We need the seat. You'll have to take it up with customer service after we depart. So my valid pass means nothing." Jamal asked, the quiet fury in his soul beginning to simmer. Delaney's smile was a razor blade. Let's not escalate this, Sai. You're holding up the flight and disrupting the cabin. He gestured vaguely toward the back of the plane. We have a seat for you. The message was brutally clear. Your proof doesn't matter. Your money doesn't matter. Your dignity doesn't matter. The only thing that mattered was his compliance. Brenda folded her arms, a smug, triumphant look on her face. Authority had spoken, and it had sided with her. A middle-aged white man in the row across from him muttered to his companion, just loud enough for Jamal to hear. Some people always think money buys respect. The comment was a small, sharp stone thrown into the churning waters of his humiliation. Jamal knew he had two choices: surrender his dignity and walk to the back of the plane, validating their prejudice, or hold his ground and face the consequences. He chose the latter. I'll wait for you to find the passenger who is actually assigned to my seat, he said calmly. Until then, I'm not moving. That was the last straw. Brenda didn't even consult Delaney. She picked up the cabin phone, her voice low but firm. We have a non-compliant passenger in first class. We require security assistance at the gate. 2 airport security officers appeared within minutes. They were large men, their uniforms and equipment designed to intimidate. Yet their language was deceptively soft, the overly polite but unyielding tone reserved for containing a threat while maintaining the illusion of order. So, could you please come with us? One of them asked, his hand hovering near Jamal's elbow. There was no debate, no discussion. He was guilty. The silent, staring passengers were his jury, and their verdict was already in. His quiet dignity was now framed as defiance, his tailored suit a costume on an imposter. With a slow, deliberate movement, Jamal stood up. He adjusted his jacket, picked up his briefcase, and walked out of the first-class cabin, the officers flanking him like a prisoner. Every eye was on him, burning holes in his back. The walk down the aisle was the longest of his life, a gauntlet of shame. As he reached the door of the plane, a young, blonde woman with an air of effortless entitlement breezed past him, escorted by a beaming Brenda. She was guided directly to his former seat, 2A. As she settled in, Jamal overheard her say, "Thank you so much, Brenda. My father will be so relieved." Then he saw it. Embroidered in neat, white script on her expensive designer carry-on was a single name, Albright. The name hit Jamal like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. Richard Albright, the ruthless, cutthroat CEO of the airline's parent company, Global A Holdings. A man known for his brutal business tactics and his even more brutal ego. A man Jamal knew all too well. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a system glitch. It was a message. For the last 6 months, Jamal had been locked in a silent, vicious corporate war with Albright. He had just spent the week in Atlanta closing a deal to acquire the very tech company Albright desperately needed to save his failing, antiquated airline empire. Jamal had outmaneuvered him, outplayed him, and won. Albright had lost, and this was his petty, racist, public revenge. This was Albright putting the black man back in his place. Standing alone in the terminal, the cold glass of the window separating him from the world, Jamal watched Flight 482 pull away from the gate. He watched the plane that held his seat, his dignity, and his enemy's daughter taxi toward the runway. He felt a fury so cold and so deep it burned away the shame, leaving behind something hard and sharp as a diamond. Albright thought he had won this little battle. He thought he had delivered a final, humiliating blow. But he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He didn't know that for the past 2 years, Jamal's private equity firm had been quietly, patiently, and relentlessly buying up a controlling interest in Global Air Holdings itself. He didn't know that Jamal was just one shareholder vote away from seizing total control. Albright's pathetic power play wasn't just an insult, it was the trigger. As the plane lifted into the sky, Jamal's phone vibrated. It wasn't a call from his office. It was a notification, a trending alert from X. He tapped the screen. The video was shaky, filmed from a few rows back. It was him. It was Brenda. It was the whole, ugly, degrading scene. And it already had over 1 million views. The caption read, They just dragged a black man out of his first-class seat for no reason. This is Global A. Make them famous. Albright thought he had humiliated one man in private. He had no idea his entire company was now on trial in the court of public opinion. And he had absolutely no idea that the man he just kicked off the plane was about to become the judge, the jury, and the executioner. In row 3, a young black woman named Tasha had watched the entire thing unfold, her heart pounding against her ribs. This feeling, this sickening, helpless feeling, she knew it all too well. It took her back 15 years to a department store with her father. He was a proud man, a man who worked 2 jobs so his daughter could have the best. He'd saved up to buy her mother a beautiful anniversary gift. But at the counter, the clerk looked right through him, serving white customer after white customer, leaving him standing there, his money in his hand, shrinking a little more with every passing minute. Tasha, just a little girl then, had tugged on his coat and asked why they wouldn't help. She would never forget the look on his face, the deep, quiet shame of a strong man being made to feel invisible. On the car ride home, he'd whispered, sometimes, honey, they just don't see us. And right then, Tasha had made a silent, tearful vow. She would never let that happen again. She would always see. Now, watching Jamal, she saw her father. She saw the same quiet dignity, the same forced calm in the face of a humiliation designed to make him feel small. She saw the condescension in Brenda's eyes, the smug satisfaction on the faces of the other passengers. When the security guards arrived, her hands started to shake, not with fear, but with the furious energy of a promise she made to a little girl in a department store. She would not be a silent bystander. She would be a witness. So she did the only thing she could. She raised her phone, the screen a small shield against the injustice, and she hit record. Standing at the gate, still reeling from the shock of the name Albright, Jamal felt his phone vibrate. He saw the video before the rest of the world did. Before the hashtags. Before the outrage. He watched the shaky footage of his own humiliation, a silent, unwilling star in a tragedy he didn't write. Tasha's caption was simple, a stock headline for the crime. They dragged a black man out of first class for sitting in the seat he paid for. This is Global A. Make them famous. And the internet did. Within an hour, the video was a raging inferno. 1 million views became 5, then 10. Flying while black exploded. Global A shame trended worldwide. The digital world is loud, chaotic, and often forgetful. But would the fury of a million strangers be enough to make a billion-dollar corporation listen? Or would the machine simply find a way to silence the noise? The first response from Global Air was a classic corporate maneuver, a hollow, calculated gesture. An internal memo was leaked, stating that the flight attendant, Brenda, had been temporarily suspended pending a full and thorough review. It was a move designed to look like action while being nothing more than a strategic pause. They weren't seeking justice. They were waiting for the storm to pass. But the storm only grew stronger. So, they moved to their next line of defense. They decided to rewrite the story. A crisp, soulless corporate statement was released, hitting the wire services and news channels. It was a masterclass in blame shifting. Following an unfortunate incident involving an operational necessity, it began, our crew acted professionally to de-escalate a situation with a non-compliant and disruptive passenger to ensure an on-time departure for the convenience of all our guests. Non-compliant. Disruptive. Suddenly, Jamal wasn't the victim. He was the cause. His quiet dignity was reframed as aggression. His refusal to be erased was painted as a disruption. It was the oldest trick in the institutional playbook. When you can't defend the act, you assassinate the character of the victim. To sell the lie, they put a face to it. A smug, perfectly polished regional director with a tight smile and empty eyes held a press briefing. He stood at a podium, the Global A Holdings logo behind him like a shield, and dismissed the viral outrage as social media exaggeration. He spoke of random system errors and the paramount importance of operational security. He never used Jamal's name, referring to him only as the individual or the passenger in question. He was trying to turn a man into a statistic, a person into a problem. Then, A reporter from the back of the room asked the question that changed everything. Can you confirm that the passenger you are referring to is Jamal Richardson, the CEO of Airline Capital? The director's perfect smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He had been prepared for questions about racism, not about power. He recovered quickly, but the damage was done. We do not comment on the personal information of our passengers, he said smoothly. But it was too late. The name was out. They hadn't just humiliated a man. They had publicly identified him. In a quiet, private lounge, Jamal watched the press conference on a large screen. His phone buzzed. It was his assistant, her voice tight with panic. Jamal, they just used your name. It's on every national news channel. The world knows it was you. Jamal didn't answer right away. He just watched the screen, his face calm, his eyes cold. He saw the smug director. He saw the reporters. He saw the name Jamal Richardson flash across the bottom of the screen under the heading Disruptive Passenger Removed. They thought they were cornering him. They thought they were winning the narrative. They saw a black man publicly shamed, his reputation under attack. Richard Albright, watching from his penthouse office, saw a corporate nuisance he had successfully swatted away. They were all wrong. They weren't looking at a victim. They were looking at a predator who had just been handed the perfect justification to strike. The world was about to learn the truth about Jamal Richardson, but not the truth they thought. Because the game wasn't over. It had just begun. Have you ever seen a storm gather on a perfectly clear day? That's what the world was watching. A storm of outrage, of hashtags, of cable news debates, all centered on one man, Jamal Richardson. But the man himself was silent. While the world screamed his name, Jamal moved like the calm eye of the hurricane. He didn't appear on talk shows to plead his case. He didn't release an angry statement on social media. Instead, he had his lawyer, a woman known for her surgical precision, issue a single, ice-cold sentence to the press. Mr. Richardson is deeply disappointed by the incident and the subsequent mischaracterization of events by Global A. He is currently exploring all his options. All his options. The phrase was elegant, vague, and terrifyingly open-ended. What options did a man like Jamal Richardson have? The world waited for a lawsuit. Richard Albright, insulated by decades of wealth and power, expected a settlement demand. He saw Jamal's silence not as a strategy, but as a weakness. He believed that every man had a price, and he was already calculating the figure that would make this PR nightmare go away. Alone in his office that night, Jamal stood before a floor-to-ceiling window, the city lights of San Francisco a sprawling galaxy below. He'd faced racism his entire life. There was the polite, country club kind, where men would ask him which athlete he was. There was the academic kind, where professors would express surprise at his eloquence. There was the financial kind, where bankers would scrutinize his loan applications with a suspicion they never showed his white counterparts. He had absorbed those 1,000 cuts with a quiet, steely resolve, channeling his anger into ambition. He'd learned to navigate a world that was not built for him and had conquered it on his own terms. But this was different. This wasn't a cut. It was a public execution of his identity. In front of a plane full of witnesses, Richard Albright hadn't just tried to take his seat. He had tried to take his name, his success, his very existence and declare it invalid. It was a brutal attempt to UN-person him, to reduce a titan of industry to a trespasser. Albright was trying to write him out of a story he had already won. And for that, a simple lawsuit, a financial settlement, would never be enough. This required a response so fundamental, so total, that it would change the very architecture of the board that had wronged him. So, the corporate machine of Global A Holdings doubled down, utterly oblivious to the war they had just declared. They went on the offensive. A high-priced lobbyist, smelling of steak and entitlement, sat with a veteran journalist in a dimly lit D.C. restaurant and casually planted the seeds of doubt. Off the record, the lobbyist murmured, swirling a glass of scotch, Richardson has a reputation. Brilliant, yes, but aggressive, uncooperative. You hear things. The next day, a thinly veiled hit piece appeared online, questioning whether the viral video told the full story. They tried to bury the truth under an avalanche of corporate spin, believing that the attention span of the public was short and that their influence was long. They thought they could control the narrative, but they were wrong. The tide of public opinion, once it turns, is a force that even titans of industry cannot command. And it was turning against Global Air with breathtaking force. The first crack in their fortress of lies came from an unexpected place, Seat 4C. A retired history professor, a white man who had initially stayed silent, was kept awake at night by his own conscience. He uploaded a second video, filmed from a different angle. This footage was crystal clear. It showed Jamal sitting calmly, his hands resting on his briefcase. It captured Brenda's condescending tone, her dismissive wave of his ticket. Crucially, it recorded the man in the opposite row muttering, "Some people always think money buys respect," a detail that proved the racial animus in the cabin was palpable. This new video ripped through the internet, and with it, the airline's narrative of a disruptive passenger was completely dismantled. Then came the flood. The leak didn't come from a high-level executive. It came from a junior analyst in the communications department, a young black woman who had been watching the company's internal response with growing horror. She saw the emails, the casual racism, the smug certainty that they could lie their way out of this. She saw in Jamal the face of her own father, her uncles, her brothers, men who had to work twice as hard for half the respect. Her hand trembled as she forwarded the entire email chain to a journalist's secure Dropbox. It was the most terrifying and the most necessary thing she had ever done. The journalist published the screenshots on X, and the internet lost its mind. One email, from the smug regional director, read, "Let's frame this as a standard procedure. This Richardson guy is a PR nuisance we need to squash before it affects Q4 bookings." Another, from Brenda's supervisor, praised her for her proactive handling of a difficult seating situation and for acting with necessary discretion to protect the experience of our priority guests. The private lies were now public knowledge. The cover-up wasn't just suspected, it was proven. The hashtags shifted. #PRNuisance began trending. The world had now seen the company's true face. Inside a sterile, glass-walled boardroom on the 50th floor, Richard Albright was finally feeling the heat. A frantic PR chief stood by a large screen displaying a deluge of negative metrics. "The sentiment analysis is 95% negative. Richard," she said, her voice strained. "We're seeing calls for a boycott from 3 major advocacy groups. #Global A Shame has been tweeted over 2 million times." Albright slammed his fist on the mahogany table. "Sentiment doesn't fly planes. Profits do," he roared. A cautious board member cleared his throat. "Richard, the stock has dropped another 3 points this morning. That's $1.5 billion in market cap erased since Monday." Albright shot him a venomous look. "Then buy the dip. This is a temporary firestorm started by one troublemaker. He's making a fool of us. Who the hell is this Jamal Richardson? I want to know everything about him. I want to know where he eats, where he sleeps, what his weaknesses are. Find me some leverage." The irony was a poison Albright couldn't taste. While the public was asking who Jamal was, they were also finding answers. Armchair detectives went to Google. They found articles in the Wall Street Journal. They found stories about his firm, Orion Capital, a private equity giant known for its silent, hostile takeovers. They learned he wasn't just some rich guy. He was a predator in the corporate world, a man who had built an empire by being smarter and more ruthless than his competition. The narrative began to shift from "look what they did to this poor man" to "do they have any idea who they just messed with?" As Albright sat in his throne room, demanding to know who his enemy was, he was completely oblivious to the truth. What Albright didn't know, what no one in that room could even fathom, was that the man he considered a PR nuisance already owned 47% of Global Air Holdings, acquired piece by piece, share by silent share, through a labyrinth of shell corporations over the last 2 years. Far away, in his minimalist office, Jamal was not watching the news. The chaos was just background noise on muted screens, a silent movie of his opponent's self-destruction. The city lights twinkled below, serene and distant. He was on a secure line with his chief analyst, his voice calm and steady, the voice of a general about to commit his final reserves. On his screen was a list of 5 names. Pension funds. Minority stakeholders. The final shareholders he needed to tip the scales from 47% to an unshakable majority. The leaks have panicked them, Jamal said, his eyes fixed on the name at the top of the list. Albright is bleeding credibility, and his stock is wounded. They are vulnerable. He took a slow, deliberate breath. It's time to make the calls. Start with the pension fund in Luxembourg. Their fiduciary duty is to their members' returns, not to Richard Albright's ego. Make the offer. The buyout clock starts now. Richard Albright was fighting a war in the press, desperately trying to save face. He had no idea he was about to lose his entire kingdom in a battle he didn't even know was being fought. If you want to see a man's true character, don't watch him during a victory. Watch him during a forced apology. 1 week after Jamal Richardson was dragged off Flight 482, Richard Albright stood on a brightly lit stage in the grand ballroom of the Four Seasons Hotel. This was his arena, a space where his wealth and power had always bent reality to his will. The Global A Holdings logo was a massive, imposing blue shield behind him, a desperate attempt to project strength and stability in the face of a crisis born of his own petty hatred. He was here to perform an act of corporate contrition for an audience of cynical journalists and a watching world. Backstage, moments before he walked out, Albright stared at his reflection as a makeup artist dabbed powder on his forehead. He wasn't remorseful. He was furious, trapped in a cage of public opinion he couldn't bully his way out of. His communications chief, a sharp woman named Eleanor, stood beside him, her face etched with worry. "Richard, I have to advise you again. The teleprompter script is too cold. The polling is catastrophic. They don't want a CEO. They want a human being. They want to see that you understand the pain you've caused. You need to show some genuine remorse." Albright waved a dismissive hand, not even looking at her. "Remorse is for the weak, Eleanor. We project strength. We admit a minor procedural error. We promise to do better, and we move on. This entire spectacle is an infuriating chore to appease a mob that will have forgotten about it by next week." He saw Jamal Richardson not as a man he had wronged, but as an obstacle, a problem to be managed. He still believed he was in control of the board, the company, the world. He walked onto the stage, the flashing cameras like 1,000 tiny explosions. The room was unnervingly quiet. The journalists weren't buzzing with anticipation. They were watching him with the cold, predatory stillness of observers who already knew the story and were just waiting for the official lie. He gripped the podium, a familiar bastion of his power, and began. His voice was a smooth, practiced baritone, but it couldn't hide the hollowness of the words. He spoke of the company's proud history, of connecting people, of the millions of passengers they served flawlessly. He was circling the issue, trying to drown the specific sin in a sea of generic corporate virtue. He was just getting to the heart of his performance, his face a mask of feigned sincerity, when the atmosphere in the room began to change. It started subtly. In the third row, a reporter for the Wall Street Journal looked down at her phone, her eyes widening. She didn't even try to hide it. She nudged her colleague, who looked at his own phone. A low, electric murmur rippled through the ballroom, a sound of digital discovery that Albright couldn't comprehend. The sound grew, a wave of whispers and screen taps. He tried to press on, his voice faltering as he lost the attention of the room. On the live news channels broadcasting the event, the chime at the bottom of the screen suddenly switched. In stark, white letters on a blood-red banner, a new reality appeared. Breaking news. Trading of Global A Holdings, JH, stock temporarily halted due to major ownership restructuring. Albright saw the commotion, the sea of faces now illuminated by the glow of their screens. He felt a cold dread creep up his spine. The world seemed to slow down, the murmuring of the crowd blurring into a dull roar in his ears. Eleanor was at the side of the stage, her face the color of chalk, frantically gesturing for him to stop. He ignored her, trying to shout over the rising chaos, a captain insisting his ship wasn't sinking even as the water rose around his ankles. The reporters were on their feet now, a pack of sharks smelling blood. They weren't asking about the flight anymore. "Mr. Albright, can you comment on the trading halt? Is Global A Holdings in the middle of a hostile takeover?" Who is restructuring your company? Sir, is it Orion Capital? That last question hit him like a physical blow. Orion Capital, Jamal Richardson's firm. The name hung in the air, an impossible, terrifying answer. Richard Albright stood frozen at the podium, speechless. He was hustled off the stage by his security, his mind a whirlwind of denial and rage. The short walk to the private elevator felt like miles. This had to be a trick, a market manipulation. Richardson was a nuisance, not a kingmaker. He was already planning the lawsuits, the brutal countersuit that would bury the man for this stunt. 50 floors up, the boardroom was in chaos. The remaining board members, who had been watching the press conference, were shouting, pointing fingers, their lifelong alliances dissolving in a matter of seconds. What is going on? Did any of you know about this? It's Richardson. It has to be. Has been buying up stock. That's impossible. We would have seen it in the SEC filings. Unless he used shell companies. My God. The heavy oak doors at the end of the room swung open. Jamal Richardson walked in. He moved with a preternatural calm that made the panic in the room feel childish and loud. This walk was different from the last time he was surrounded by strangers in a space owned by Global A. There was no shame here, no humiliation, only the cold, quiet weight of victory. He looked at the terrified faces, the men and women who had allowed Albright's toxic culture to fester, and felt nothing but a distant pity. He walked to the head of the long mahogany table, to the empty leather chair where Richard Albright was supposed to be sitting. He didn't sit. He simply placed his hands on the polished wood. "Good afternoon," he said. His voice was quiet, yet it silenced the room instantly. "My name is Jamal Richardson. As of 10 minutes ago, my fame, Orion Capital, completed its acquisition of a 51% controlling interest in Global Air Holdings. I am the new majority shareholder." The room fell into a deep, profound silence, the kind that follows an explosion. It was done. "I believe our CEO is needed here," Jamal said, his voice still unnervingly calm. "Someone please go and get him." Minutes later, a disheveled and enraged Richard Albright was ushered into the boardroom. He stopped dead when he saw Jamal standing at the head of his table. For a long moment, the two men locked eyes, the humiliated and the humiliator, the victim and the victor. Albright's face was a storm of disbelief and pure, unadulterated hatred. "You?" Albright spat, his voice trembling with rage. "You have no idea what you've done. You think you can just walk in here? The board will never allow this. I'll sue you into oblivion." Jamal allowed a small, cold smile to touch his lips. He gestured to the silent, terrified faces around the table. "Richard, these people don't work for you anymore. They work for me." He leaned forward slightly. "You wanted to put me in my place, so I decided to buy the place." He then turned his attention to the board, his voice becoming sharp and surgical as he tapped the tablet in front of him. A new image appeared on the massive screen behind him. It was the email from the regional director. The words "PR nuisance we need to squash" were highlighted in red. "Mr. Harris," Jamal said, looking directly at the smug director, "your record of dismissing 47 credible discrimination complaints is appalling. Your resignation for misleading the public in this company is accepted, effective immediately. Security will see you out." The director sat frozen, his face ashen. Jamal swiped the screen. A picture of Brenda's manager appeared, along with a glowing performance review she had written for Brenda just 2 weeks prior, praising her for her firmness with non-compliant customers. As for the flight crew and management who enabled this culture, Jamal continued, his voice dropping, their terminations are also effective immediately. He took a breath, and for a fleeting second, he felt the cold floor of the jet bridge, the silent judgment of the passengers, the ghost of a security guard's hand on his arm. The memory fueled the cold fire in his soul. This company will have a zero-tolerance policy for this behavior, starting today. The news exploded. The story was a modern-day fable, a tale of injustice and epic retribution that captured the world's imagination. Jamal Richardson became a folk hero overnight. Later that evening, the boardroom was finally quiet. Jamal stood alone in the vast space. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, which overlooked the distant, glittering runways of the airport. He watched a plane with a Global Air logo, his logo now, ascend into the night sky. He had won. He had absolute power. He could feel the intoxicating pull of pure vengeance, the dark, satisfying desire to utterly crush Richard Albright, to fire him, to ruin him, to erase him from the industry. But as he watched the plane disappear into the clouds, he felt the immense weight of his new reality. He hadn't just bought a company. He had inherited millions of passengers and tens of thousands of employees. He had fought his way to the top of a broken system. Now he owned it. Was breaking one man enough? Or did this moment demand something more? He had avenged his humiliation. He had punished the guilty. He had seized the throne. But now, Jamal Richardson faced the most difficult question of all. Was this about retribution, or was it about redemption? Power is not about the moment you seize the throne. It's about what you do the morning after. The Global A Holdings boardroom was the same room where Jamal's fate had been decided by smug, indifferent men. But today, the air itself was different. The tension was still there, but it wasn't the lazy arrogance of the old guard. It was the sharp, nervous energy of an institution that knows its world has been turned upside down. Jamal sat at the head of the table, not in Albright's old chair, but in a simple, modern one he'd had brought in. It was his first official board meeting as majority shareholder, and the holdovers from Albright's reign watched him with a mixture of fear and resentment. They expected a tyrant. They were about to get a teacher. Jamal didn't start with threats. He didn't start with financials. He started with a single, damning question. For the last decade, he began, his voice calm and even, what has been this company's single greatest liability? The board members shifted uncomfortably. One mumbled about rising fuel costs. Another mentioned union disputes. No, Jamal said, silencing them. Our greatest liability has been a culture of exclusion. A culture that sees a paying customer in first class and decides he doesn't belong. A culture that values the comfort of a priority passenger over the dignity of another human being. That culture is a cancer. It has made us blind. It has made us weak. And as the world has just seen, it has made us infamous. Today, that culture starts to die. He laid out his vision, not as a suggestion, but as a series of directives. He announced a mandatory company-wide anti-bias and diversity reform program, run by the top DEI firm in the country. This won't be a 2-hour seminar with donuts and coffee, he said coldly. This will be a deep, ongoing, and uncomfortable re-education of this company from the baggage handlers to the boardroom. He then announced the creation of a new C-suite position, Chief of Culture and Inclusion, reporting directly to him. And I'm pleased to announce that I'm appointing someone from within our own ranks to fill it, an exceptional senior manager from the Atlanta hub named Anaya Johnson. The promotion of a black woman to the highest level of the company sent a silent, powerful shockwave through the room. Finally, he established a new, independent customer experience oversight committee. This committee will have the power to review any and all discrimination complaints, and it will include seats for passenger advocates and civil rights leaders. We are going to hold ourselves accountable, even when it hurts. A portly board member named Henderson, a longtime crony of Albright's, finally summoned the courage to object. He framed his concern in the careful, coded language of plausible deniability. Jamal, he began, his tone condescending. With all due respect, these are costly initiatives. Our fiduciary duty is to shareholder value, not social engineering. Jamal met his gaze without flinching. On the large screen behind him, he projected a series of charts. Mr. Henderson, data shows that companies in the top quartile for ethnic and cultural diversity are 36% more profitable than their competitors. This isn't social engineering. This is market intelligence. Shareholder value will follow a culture of respect, not the other way around. As Henderson opened his mouth to argue, an aide slipped Jamal a note. He glanced at it, and it seems the market agrees, Jamal said, a hint of a smile on his lips. Our stock is up 12% since the market opened. It seems our shareholders have an appetite for a new direction. Henderson fell silent, His argument about shareholder value instantly vaporized by the very thing he claimed to protect. He had the vision. He had the power. But changing a culture is like turning a battleship. Could one man truly fix a system built on decades of prejudice? The board was silent, the fight gone out of them. Then, another member asked the question that hung in the air like smoke. And what about Richard? Jamal paused, letting the tension coil in the room. This was a moment they were all waiting for, the final, vengeful blow. "I'm not firing Richard Albright," he said. The board looked stunned. Firing him would allow him to become a martyr. It would be an ending. "I'm not interested in endings. I'm interested in lessons." He announced that Albright would be stripped of his CEO title, his board seat, and all executive authority. His new title would be Senior Advisor for Legacy Operations. His one and only job would be to oversee the audit of the old, broken systems he himself had created. "He will have an office on the ground floor," Jamal said quietly, "and he will report to Ms. Johnson." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. It was a sentence of corporate damnation. He was forcing Albright to stay and watch, a powerless ghost in his own kingdom, as a black man and a black woman dismantled his life's work, piece by piece. The meeting concluded. Later that day, Anaya Johnson, the newly appointed Chief of Culture and Inclusion, entered Jamal's new office. Her face was grim. "We've already started the audit of the training manuals," she said, holding up a tablet. "We found something. It's not just a lack of training, Jamal. It's written policy." She showed him the page. It was from the Flight Attendant Handbook, under the section titled De-escalation and Discretion. It contained a coded, but unmistakable, system for profiling passengers. It instructed crew to be on the lookout for customers who do not fit the typical customer profile for premium cabins, and to use operational necessity as a justification for reseating them to maintain cabin harmony. Jamal stared at the words. It was the playbook for what had happened to him, written in black and white. He had changed the men and women at the top, but the poison of the old regime was written into the very DNA of the company. Now he had the proof. But what would he do when he came face to face with the people who were not just the architects of the system, but its products? What is the price of true justice? Punishment or re-education? Revenge can satisfy the moment, but it can't build a future. Jamal Richardson had won the war, but now he had to win the peace, and that battle would not be fought in a boardroom, but in the human heart. Months had passed since the takeover. The world of Global A Holdings was changing, slowly but surely. The change was most visible at the company's new National Training Center in Chicago. It was a bright, modern space, with glass walls and light wood floors. On the walls, the old, stuffy corporate portraits had been replaced with photos of the company's diverse workforce, alongside new slogans: "Respect in every direction," and "Our strength is in our welcome." Jamal arrived unannounced, standing at the back of a training session for new flight attendants. Anaya Johnson, his new Chief of Culture and Inclusion, was at the front of the room, leading a role-playing exercise. She presented a case study to the fresh-faced recruits. A first-class passenger with a valid ticket is asked to move for a priority passenger and is ultimately removed from the plane by security. She didn't use Jamal's name, but everyone in the room knew the story. What were the assumptions made here? Anaya asked the class. At what point could a different choice have led to a better outcome? Then, she paused. To help us understand, I'd like to introduce a guest speaker. Someone who has lived the consequences of getting it wrong. From a seat at the side of the room, Brenda stood up and walked to the front. She looked smaller now, stripped of the uniform and the authority that had been her armor. She was just a woman, her face etched with a kind of weary regret. Her new job was not to fly, but to teach. She was a living lesson, a diversity trainee whose story was now a mandatory part of the curriculum. It was the fate Jamal had chosen for her, not a simple termination, but a difficult, daily act of accountability. She scanned the faces of the new recruits, and then her eyes found Jamal at the back of the room. She visibly flinched, her composure faltering for a second. After the session, as the trainees filed out, she approached him, her hands twisting nervously. "Mr. Richardson," she began, her voice barely a whisper. I never got the chance to apologize properly. There are no excuses for what I did. I saw your suit. I saw the color of your skin, and I made an assumption. It was wrong. It was ugly, and I am truly, deeply sorry. Here she was, the woman who had publicly humiliated him, the visible symbol of the prejudice that had ignited this firestorm, standing before him completely at his mercy. What do you do in that moment? When the person who caused you so much pain is standing before you, completely broken? Is forgiveness a form of strength, or is it a betrayal of your own pain? Jamal looked at her, at the genuine remorse in her eyes, and he saw not an enemy, but a product of a poison system. You weren't the problem, Brenda, he said, and the words surprised even himself with their clarity. You were the symptom. He explained the training manual he'd discovered, the unwritten rules of a corporate culture created by Richard Albright that rewarded her exact behavior. That system, he said, his voice quiet but firm, taught you to see a threat where you should have seen a customer. I don't blame you for learning the lessons your bosses were teaching. He extended his hand. She looked at it, stunned, before taking it in a trembling grip. Your work here, Jamal told her, teaching this new generation not to make the same mistakes, is more valuable to this company than any punishment I could have ever devised. You're helping me fix the system that broke you. He had chosen transformation over retaliation. In the following weeks, the media narrative around him solidified. Some still called him ruthless, but more and more, they painted him as a new kind of leader, a symbol of power with purpose. He was both the avenger and the reformer. He was leaving the training center, feeling a sense of cautious optimism, when his phone buzzed. It was his assistant. Her voice was tight with an anxiety he hadn't heard since the day of the takeover. Jamal, she said, it's Richard Albright. He's invoking the final clause in his senior advisory contract. He's demanding a face-to-face meeting. He says he's ready to talk about the future. Jamal stood still, the optimistic energy of the day draining away, replaced by a cold, familiar sense of caution. Albright didn't care about the future. He only cared about the past. Jamal had offered grace to the symptom of the disease. But now, he was being summoned to a final meeting with the disease itself. Can you truly heal a wound when the man who inflicted it refuses to even believe he ever held the knife? What is the true measure of a victory? Is it the moment you defeat your enemy, or the moment you realize what you're building in their place? The final confrontation with Richard Albright didn't happen in a boardroom or on a stage. It happened a few days after Jamal's visit to the training center, in a small, sterile office on the ground floor of the company headquarters. This was Albright's new domain, a corporate cage with a window that looked out onto the parking garage. It was a long way from the penthouse suite he once commanded. Jamal had agreed to the meeting. He walked in to find Albright looking older, smaller, but with the same venom in his eyes. He wasn't there to apologize or seek forgiveness. He was there to plant a final seed of poison. I have to hand it to you, Richardson, Albright began, a sneer playing on his lips. It's a masterful performance. The diversity training, the new slogans, the public atonement. You played the game well. He leaned forward, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. But you and I know the truth. You can't change what people really are. You can own the plane, but you'll never change the hearts and minds of the passengers or the crew. They'll smile to your face, they'll go through your little re-education classes, but they will always resent you. You are a king in a kingdom of enemies. You haven't built a new culture. You've just put a pretty mask on an old monster. He was trying to undermine everything, to make Jamal's monumental victory feel hollow and temporary. He was trying to say that prejudice was a force more powerful than any one man. Jamal listened patiently, letting the bitter words hang in the air. When Albright was finished, Jamal looked at him, not with anger, but with a kind of clinical pity. You still don't get it, Richard, he said calmly. You think power is about control, about forcing people to bend to your will. I'm proving that true power is about earning trust. Your way of doing business, your way of seeing the world, it's over. It's a relic. I didn't just buy your company. I bought its tombstone. Jamal stood up. Your advisory contract has been terminated, effective immediately. We no longer require your services. He didn't wait for a response. He simply turned and walked away, leaving Richard Albright alone in his tiny office, a defeated man left with nothing but his own hatred. Could one man's vision truly overcome a century of ingrained prejudice? Or was Albright right? Was this all just a temporary performance of progress? 1 year later, we got our answer. The company was no longer called Global Air Holdings. It had been rebranded, reborn as Nexus Air, with a new logo that symbolized connection and unity. The company's global headquarters was buzzing with an energy it had never known before. It was the 1-year anniversary of the new ownership, and Jamal was hosting a major event for employees, press, and stakeholders to unveil the company's new global marketing campaign. He stood on stage, a confident and settled leader. A year ago, he began, "We promised a new direction. We promised to listen, to learn, and to build a company that truly saw and valued every single person who walked onto our planes. We believe that a company's legacy isn't built on what it hides, but on what it has the courage to fix. This campaign is the foundation of that legacy." The lights in the grand hall dimmed. A massive screen flickered to life. The first image was shaky, raw cell phone footage from inside a first-class cabin. It was Tasha's video. The audience gasped. They were watching the public humiliation of the very man who now owned the company. The tension in the room was thick enough to taste as they watched the footage of Jamal being escorted off the plane. Then, just at the peak of the humiliation, the footage froze on Jamal's calm, dignified face. A new narrator's voice, warm and powerful, filled the room. "We could pretend this never happened," the voice said. "We could bury it. We could hope you'd forget." The image dissolved into a montage of the new Nexus Air. Diverse flight crews laughing together. A young black girl looking out a window at the clouds, her eyes wide with wonder. The new training sessions, with Brenda herself helping to lead a class. But a legacy isn't built on pretending, the narrator continued. It's built on promising that this will never happen again. To anyone. The final shot was a plane soaring through a beautiful sunrise. And the tagline appeared in bold, elegant letters, Nexus Air. Every seat deserves respect. The room was silent for a heartbeat, processing the sheer audacity of it. Then, the applause started. It wasn't polite corporate clapping. It was a roar, a heartfelt, thunderous standing ovation. Jamal had taken the very instrument of his shame and forged it into a shield, a promise, the very cornerstone of his company's new identity. He hadn't erased the past. He had owned it and bent it toward the light. Later, as the event wound down, Jamal stood by a large window, looking out at the city skyline. The weight of the last year, the fight, the victory, the burden of building something new, all settled on him. In the quiet of the moment, he whispered to himself a final, definitive truth. Sometimes, the best revenge is ownership. Jamal Richardson proved that one man could by the system that tried to break him. He remade an entire airline in the image of respect. But his story leaves us with one final, haunting question. If you were in his shoes, faced with the same injustice but without his billions, without his hidden power, would you have been able to do the same? Or would the system, as it's designed, have won? If you believe every person's dignity matters, whether they are a CEO or not, then help us tell their stories. Like this video to stand for respect. Share it to start a conversation. And subscribe to join our movement, ensuring that no voice is ever silenced again.